I'm going to talk today about supervised injection facilities. I'm going to actually present a fair bit of the background and talk a little bit about what happened after we released our report. So part of this talk is going to be about modeling. It's actually only a very small part of the talk. This is more sort of an HTA type talk about doing controversial policy relevant research. And I will try and end with some reflections that I hope are somewhat insightful about that as well. So I have no commercial disclosures. This research was funded primarily by the Ontario HIV Treatment Network, and then we had a dissemination grant as well from the CIHR. So I want to review the policy debate about supervised injection sites or supervised injection facilities in Canada. I want to talk a little bit about a cost-effective model that we did to try and say what might be the optimal number of sites for Toronto and for Ottawa. And then I want to discuss how these results and other findings were used as part of the ongoing debate. So I want to say right up front, we are trying to model something which doesn't exist and which is highly contextual in nature. So there is a lot of uncertainty in what I'm going to show you. There are many potential sources of bias. In general, our approach was to be realistic in terms of the assumptions that we made, but where we erred, we tried to err on being conservative. In other words, trying to estimate, if our estimates are, if we had a choice, we tried to say that pick those parameters that would make it seem less cost effective rather than more cost effective to establish supervised injection facilities. So we erred on the side of under-predicting some health benefits and over-predicting some costs. So in reality, it might be more cost effective than we report, but we might have got this wrong. So it actually still might be less cost effective. We haven't done a formal probabilistic sensitivity analysis, but there are going to be wide confidence intervals around these. And one of our key recommendations actually is that if a facility is established, there has to be evaluation of that facility in order to see if some of the assumptions that we made actually hold or not. So I'm going to present a series of questions that we went through to try and determine whether it makes sense for Toronto and Ottawa to have a supervised injection facility, and if it does make sense, to say how many supervised injection facilities would be optimal. So the first question we actually had to ask ourselves were, how many people actively inject drugs in Toronto, and how many people actively inject drugs in Ottawa? And surprisingly to me, this was not a very easy number to come by. And the police actually give very low estimates for this number. People who work with people who inject drugs tend to give very high estimates for these numbers, but all of those estimates are just guesses. We used a number of different approaches to try and get at this. The first thing we did is, so first we're interested in people who are currently using, so currently injecting drugs. So this is actually somewhat challenging because a lot of the estimates mix people who have injected in the past with but have stopped with people who are continuing to inject currently. They're illegal drugs. These are illegal drugs. Illegal drugs. So the first thing we did was to look at HIV infection rates. So we used a survey known as iTrack. This is actually an international survey done in multiple cities across the world of people who inject illicit drugs. And there was a survey done in 2008 in Toronto, and they collected samples from everybody who was in the survey. They came up with an estimate of about 3.15% of people were HIV positive with confidence intervals as shown there. Rob Remus at the Dalla School of Public Health in his internal HIV monitoring unit has estimated that there are about 450 people who are alive have a history of injection drug use. And so if we apply this percentage to this and divide through, we end up with an estimated population of about 14,000 people for the city of Toronto who inject drugs. And we can use the limits of the confidence bound, and we get an estimate of somewhere between 7,000 and 32,000. But as I said before, this includes both people who are currently injecting and people who've injected in the past. So in the HIV reporting forms, it just asks if injecting drug use is a risk factor for acquiring HIV, and it doesn't differentiate between whether that is ongoing and if it's past, how long ago in the past that is. So this, if anything, is probably an overestimate, this 14,000. It's also not entirely clear that this survey is necessarily representative of all people that inject drugs. So that was one estimate. Another estimate is trying to look at how many people use methadone, report using methadone, again in the survey, and looking at how many methadone prescriptions there are, and then calculating from that. But again, this includes methadone. People who take methadone are not always people who inject. People who take oral opioids can also be prescribed methadone. And again, it doesn't necessarily differentiate between past and current use. But we get a number actually that's pretty close to the 14,000, about 13,000. But again, that's probably an overestimate. We could look at the number of people who reported that they have overdosed. That gives us an estimate of about 4,000. But that seems kind of low. And overdoses might not be recorded. So that's using hospital ISIS records of overdose for opioids. And perhaps those are coded inconsistently, we don't know. But that might actually be an underestimate. And then other people have done modeling and come up with a number, again, somewhere in this range of 17,000. But again, that probably includes both past and current injectors. So here's what we decided to do. We built a model, and I'm going to tell you about the model in a bit. We actually said the things that we are most confident about are the prevalence of HIV. We had some information from iTracker about the frequency of injecting and needle sharing, and we knew what the prevalence and incidence cases for both HIV and hepatitis C were. And we said this is probably the strongest data. We can calibrate our model within these parameters, and that gave us an estimate of about 9,000 people who are actively injecting drugs in Toronto. And that's the number that we decided to go with. So somewhat less than the 13 to 17,000, but that probably includes past injectors, and explored a wide range in sensitivity analysis. So that was the first question. The second question is, where do those people actually live, or more importantly, where do they actually use drugs? And so we used ISIS data for this. We used hospital discharge records. We used emergency room visits. We used physician billings. The physician billings are problematic because there's really just one catch-all code for addiction that doesn't differentiate between what kinds of drugs. We used methadone prescribing data, and we used emergency, we actually, this is not from ISIS, but we had separate data from EMS services about where they actually pick up people who have overdosed. So when somebody has overdosed and an ambulance is called, they record that where they picked up the person, and they record it as an overdose in the court. We looked at opioid-specific codes whenever we could. Sometimes we had specific opioids like methadone. Sometimes we had cocaine codes, and sometimes we only had addiction codes. And remember, what we're trying to do here is just map drug use throughout the city. We already have the numbers, so now we're just trying to look at the distribution of drug use. We decided to do those separately because these will lead to very small numbers in some neighborhoods and a lot of uncertainty. So this is a map of the city of Toronto. Each segment here is what's known as a forward sortation area, or FSA. The FSA is the first three characters of the postal code. M5 B for St. Michael's. F51W is the postal code, so the FSA is M5B. And so remember I told you we had many different data sources and we had different codes. And so these are showing just 6 combinations of data sources and codes. And this is by decile. So higher drug use is darker purple, lighter drug use is white or light blue. And this is really to show you that we get a fairly consistent picture in Toronto of the neighborhoods where there is more drug use and where there's less drug use. Sometimes we get some neighborhoods that light up in one picture but not in another. So, no, there's less use. We had data for every FSA. So, and you can see some are all drug, opioid, cocaine, or methadone. Some it's just multiple drug use, and so on. Here's a picture for Ottawa. Actually, one other thing that I want to say about Toronto maps. The other thing you'll notice is that, as we all know, Toronto's a big city. Right? But there's not a single neighborhood here that lights up. There are multiple neighborhoods that light up. So one of the characteristics of Toronto is that drug use is dispersed throughout the city. This is very different from Vancouver, where inside exists now, where there's a single neighborhood which has the largest concentration of drug use. So here's Ottawa. And you can see, in contrast to Toronto, there are actually a couple of neighborhoods that light up a lot. And this neighborhood as well, that here has some drug use. But in contrast to Ottawa, in contrast to Toronto, Ottawa does have a concentration of drug use in some neighborhoods. And in particular, for those of you who know Ottawa, this is the Byward Market area, which should come as no surprise to anybody who knows the drug scene in Ottawa. The problem building Stephen Harper's office is actually just right there as well, which is interesting.
These are the numbers are absolute or the population?
No, those are absolute numbers because we wanted to say the absolute numbers is actually what will determine how many people will actually visit the facility, which is what we need. So the next question is, how many people would actually visit a facility if it was established? So again, we don't really know this, but we had some data from iTrack that enable us to do some of this modeling. I'll preface this by saying there was similar data from Vancouver before the facility in Vancouver was established. And what they found was that the proportion of people who said they would use the facility before it was actually established was roughly equivalent to the proportion of people who used the facility after it was established, but it wasn't the same people. Okay? Some people who said they weren't going to actually did, and some people said they weren't going to. Some people said they weren't going to actually did, and vice versa. But overall, the proportion was about the same. So about 79% of people said that they would use a facility if one were established in Toronto for injection. Slightly lower numbers for smoking. I'm not going to talk a lot about smoking today. People were also asked how far they would travel, and about 72% that they would travel up to a kilometer, but not further than a kilometer. And there was also a question about, would you take public transit? Essentially, what we ended up assuming was that facility would capture about multiple of these two, so about 56% of people in that area would be within 1 kilometer and would use the facility. Another proportion would be between 1 and 5 kilometers, but that we assume that nobody would travel more than 5 kilometers to visit the facility to use drugs. And we assume that the first facility would be located in that neighborhood. It's going back to your question, where there is the highest number people that would use it. The second facility would be, and then we assumed that those people would use, then we took those people out of the mix, and then the second facility would be located in the neighborhood where the second greatest number of people would be located. And we just used the geographic center of the FSA for simplicity. We didn't have actual addresses for people. We just had the FSAs. We can't actually determine how far they live. So we for simplicity, again, we assumed that they were evenly distributed across that FSA, which is a simplifying assumption, but it's the best thing we could do with the data we have.
How did you ask them this? How did you identify people?
So this is from the iTrack survey. They actually, of the people who actually were recruited into the survey, there were specific questions of would you use a correct check. So remember, drug use is dispersed throughout Toronto. The FSAs are pretty big. 80% of people roughly said they would use a facility, 70% they would use one, but of those, only 70% would use one for within a kilometer. So taking into account the geography and the proportion, the first facility would be used by somewhere around 11% of people in the city. So unlike Vancouver, unlike Ottawa, where a facility can be located centrally and attract a lot of significant proportion of the population, a single facility will capture about something more than 10%. But the second facility would capture almost the same number of people, and the third facility would also capture about the same number of people. So 3 facilities end up capturing about 30% of the population of people who use drugs. I don't think I put the curve for Ottawa here, but the curve for Ottawa actually is has a much steeper rise. It starts at a higher intercept, has a steeper rise, and then flattens much more quickly. So that determines how many people would use a facility. Next, we have to think about what are the benefits of the facility. And the main benefits are going to come really from decreased transmission of blood-borne infections, and also from decreased overdose. Actually, I forgot to say one thing. So remember I said we had multiple maps. What we ended up deciding was actually to use the map for methadone pharmacy, where people get their methadone dispensed. And we did that for a couple of reasons. One was that when you actually looked at the absolute numbers, the numbers for some of the other indicators that we had were low, considerably lower even than our estimate, whereas the numbers for methadone users were considerably higher. And we don't really know why that is, but we have some thoughts. And it's probably because if you get a health card, the address on your health card is your last known home address. And the health cards with pictures are updated regularly. The old red and white health cards that some of you might have, which are eventually going to be phased out now, those are not updated. So, but people who use drugs probably have two characteristics we know from other research. They tend to move to big cities where drugs are more available. And they sometimes there's a higher prevalence of homelessness. So their address on their health card may reflect the last address that they lived in at their parents' house or when they were last stably housed, but not necessarily, which might be outside of Toronto. But the address where they get their methadone is probably a better reflection of the proximity where they're actually using their drugs. So what we end up deciding in terms of the mass is to actually use the methadone prescribing pharmacy. So decreased blood-borne transmission, decreased overdoses. We actually decided not to include overdoses. I'll tell you why later. We focused mostly on decreased meal sharing. And so we looked at the number of days injected per week, the number of injections per day when injecting. We assume that 18% of people shared needles over 6 months. Again, this is from iTrack data. These are Toronto data. It's actually higher in Ottawa, portion of needle sharing. we, again, calibrated our model. This is one of the calibration parameters. We end up with an average of about 480 injections per person per year. So slightly more than one injection per day on average per person per year. It's actually really challenging in the literature to find an estimate of how often people inject. And it probably depends a lot on which drug people are injecting. So cocaine tends to be injected many more times per day than opioids. But many people who inject opioids do only inject once per day. There was data from Vancouver that people who use the supervised injection, actually this is not phrased very clearly. People who use the supervised injection facility decrease their needle sharing by 70%. So that doesn't mean only the needle sharing within the facility. That's their overall rate of needle sharing. So that there may be benefits from using the facility in terms of education, supplies of clean needles, and so on, that extend beyond just the injections that occur within the facility itself. So we assumed a similar efficacy for our base case as was observed in Vancouver. That there would be a 70% reduction in needle sharing amongst people who still shared needles and other equipment, as was observed in Vancouver. So again, this is uncertain. We don't no idea if this is actually going to be what's observed in Toronto or not. But this is really the only estimate in the literature of the effectiveness of supervised injection. So next, we want to extend that to say, what would that mean in terms of this transmission of HIV and hepatitis C? We didn't include hepatitis B. Again, hepatitis B is an important health problem, but there are actually few epidemiological data available for modeling hepatitis. So Toronto adult population age 15 to 64. We had some data on the drug use behavior. We modeled the drug use behavior rather. We modeled their HIV and hepatitis C disease states. We assumed homogeneous random mixing. We assumed that HIV but not hepatitis C was transmitted sexually, and that both HIV and hepatitis C were transmitted by needle sharing. 20-year time horizon, and a 5% discount rate. So these are the drug use states. We have people who smoke crack cocaine, people who inject opioid drugs. We actually, for the data that we have for both Toronto and Ottawa, suggested that almost everybody who injects drugs smokes at least some crack cocaine as well. It was over about 95% of people. So we didn't actually model a state of the combination because we assumed that these people actually did both. We assumed that people moved in and out of methadone and now bupropion being here as well in terms of other opioid substitution therapies, and that people could move in and out of drug use altogether. With these should be HIV, and these are hepatitis C states. These are HIV negative, these are HIV positive. HIV negative without hepatitis C, these are HIV positive with hepatitis C co-infected states. And again, we modeled the transmission between those, including being diagnosed with HIV and being diagnosed with hepatitis C. We didn't model the newest hepatitis C treatments. So these are still based on sort of old treatment with ribavirin and interferon. So here are some of the model calibration. But actually, we've updated the model since the report was published. So these are sort of the latest results in the paper that's being submitted. So here are our target values, and here are our model output values for Toronto and for Ottawa. I'm not going to go through all of them, but if you just look down, what we really want is for these numbers to be close to these numbers, and for these numbers to be close to these numbers. And you can see, I think, that the model is fairly well calibrated. And then next, we had to actually think about the costs of each facility. So we looked at the healthcare costs for the general population for people who use drugs, people living with HIV, with hepatitis C, or people co-infected with both HIV and hepatitis C, costs related to methadone. We didn't have, it's actually very hard to find costs for cocaine-related use. We have some estimates from Australia, but the relative cost of cocaine versus heroin, which is what we ended up using, it's not really optimal. And then we had to actually estimate the cost of running the facility. And again, that's a hard number to estimate. We know the Vancouver facility costs just under $3 million per year in operating costs. But the Vancouver facility really exists as a freestanding storefront structure. People walk in there to the facility. It's not linked to a community health center or a hospital or any other health facility. So they pay rent, they pay insurance, they have all of their own infrastructure. We asked them, but they were actually unable to give us a breakdown of how much of those costs were fixed and how much were variable. The variable costs really are the per user costs. Remember, we said that in Toronto, the facilities, each facility is going to capture a small proportion of the population. So it's important to actually know what the variable costs are to actually be able to scale up and down the net cost. We know, however, from Sydney in Australia, where there is a supervised industrial facility as well, that slightly less than half of their costs are fixed costs. We end up assuming the fixed costs would be about half of this, and that the variable costs we calculated, again, based on that formula. I will say right now, remember I said that we would try to be conservative in our costs. These are almost certainly conservative because it is nobody, meaning neither from our report, nor from the medical officer of health from the city, nor from any of the community groups who have advocated for this, is advocating for a freestanding facility such as exists in Vancouver. Almost certainly the model for Toronto will be a facility integrated within an existing healthcare facility, like a community health center or a hospital. So that these costs are probably considerably less because of that. So the top half of the table is for Toronto, the bottom half is for Ottawa. You can see explored establishing up to 5 facilities. Here are the net costs in millions of dollars. This emerges over 20 years. This is the net quality gains. Here are the incremental costs and the incremental qualities. And you can see that in Toronto, the first facility has a cost per quality of about $18,000. Second one about $23,000, and the third one about $28,000. You'll recall that each facility captured slightly fewer portion of the population, but the first 3 were roughly equal, which is why these don't change very much. And then 4 facilities would get up above $50,000. So we said add a cost-effective. What we said in our report was add a cost-effective threshold of $50,000 per quality. 3 facilities for Toronto would be optimal. Of course, that's not what was reported in the headlines. The headlines just report says 3 facilities for Toronto. And again, for Ottawa, the first 2 facilities, cost per quality remains less than 15. That 3 jumps to $86,000. So we said 2 facilities for Ottawa. And here's some sensitivity analysis. Here are the facility costs. Remember, I said that the facility costs were really uncertain. If anything, we probably overestimated the facility costs. The facility costs were probably less than what we estimated. And here's the relative risk of needle sharing, which again, we said was 0.3. There's 70% reduction. So that gives us, in this zone here, which this is using $50,000 per quality as a threshold. So if there's a lower price, you can see it actually favorable for more facilities. Needle sharing is less effective, fewer facilities, but it has to get pretty little effectiveness and fairly high cost before we get to the case where there are no facilities are optimal. And here's again, two-way sensitivity analysis for Ottawa. This time looking at the number of people who inject drugs. We estimated it was like 2,000 in Ottawa. Over a little bit. And there's also viscous needle sharing. And again, you can see that this is 2 facilities. These are 3 facilities. This is 1 facility. So somewhat less sensitive, but again, somewhere around 2 facilities are probably optimal for Ottawa. So there's a lot of parameter uncertainty. There's a lot of self-reported data. There's uncertainty in the administrative data. We used this uncertainty in the model. We've seen homogeneous mixing, but that may or may not actually be a strong assumption. We didn't include overdoses in part because it's actually very hard to, without doing a manual chart review, to actually get from the coroner which those overdoses are intentional and which are unintentional, and which are due to injection opioids and which are due to oral opioids. So the coroner records opioid overdoses on the form, and there is some flag for obvious suicides, but the coroner themselves told us that they were not very confident in that flag. So what we were really interested in is unintentional injection opioid deaths, which we could have made some guesses on, but and then non-fatal overdoses is even harder to capture. We ended up just not including those and recognizing it as a limitation of the model. We also did this in part because we had done similar modeling for Vancouver, the Vancouver facility. We did that before they had published their overdose data, and so we wanted some comparability between our model and the Vancouver. We didn't include increased access to health services. Again, this is a purported benefit of supervised injection facilities, that people who go to such facilities can be referred on to drug treatment or opioid substitution therapy. And we didn't include community indicators. So these could be positive or they could be negative. Positive community indicators would be things like less litter, drug-related litter, less open injection on the streets, those sorts of things. Negative community indicators might be things like congregation of people around the facility, so-called magnet effects. The evidence for these, I'd say, is weak to moderate at best. There is some evidence from Vancouver that community indicators did not get any worse and maybe got better. There's some evidence, however, from some European sites that there is increased congregation of people who use drugs around some facilities. So I'm going to switch gears for the next 5 to 10 minutes and talk about sort of the health policy, knowledge translation, dissemination part of this. So we released a report 2 years ago now. We had a press conference. This is me. It's my co-principal investigator, Carol Strike. I've never held a press conference before. There were lots of media there. We made the front page of all the major newspapers in Toronto, except for the Toronto Star, which we had actually made the front page a few times already of the Star, but we had like a 4-page pull-out section in the Star report. We made the front page of the Ottawa papers as well. We had 6 recommendations, and I put this slide up not so much because I wanted to dwell on the recommendations, but just to say, you know, what I presented to you actually is because just later on I want to put some of the modeling stuff. This is actually a comprehensive mixed method study. We did a lot of qualitative research as well. We analyzed some of the epidemiological data. We did focus groups and interviews with business owners, with residents, with police and fire and ambulance. We had permission from both chiefs of police to say that we interviewed them, which we did, and included their perspectives in the report. So I'm just going to quickly say, you know, our first recommendation was that both cities would benefit from implementation of the facility. The optimal model is integrated within an existing organization, as I said already. There needs to be a strong evaluation plan. There should be clearly established rules. We said that there was insufficient evidence to support a recommendation to implement supervised smoking, because we also looked at that, which I haven't presented here today. said that this was a topic for future research. We're really talking about smoking crack here rather than smoking other drugs. And that it should be part of a comprehensive drug strategy. So there were 115 different, according to the media people of my hospital, count such things. There were 115 different mentions in various media, BBC, Global, CTV, CNN International did like a whole little special launch supervised injection facilities. The National Post had an op-ed. They didn't have an official editorial, but they had an op-ed that was strongly supportive of our recommendations, as did the Toronto Sun, as did the Globe and Mail. Both Toronto Sun and Globe and Mail had official editorials that were supported by the editorial. The Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail. The Toronto Sun was not expect. In fact, Sun TV, somebody in Sun TV called us pointy-headed researchers from St. Michael's Hospital, the rhythmic heart of junkie land, which I like so much so that I said I was going to put this on my next business card. So I get so the Minister of Health, the ministry had a report about a month before it was released. So they prepared their statement. So they thanked us for our report. They said they're always prepared to listen to good advice. They make their decisions based on evidence. And they said experts continue to be divided on the value of the sites. We have no plans to pursue supervised sites at this time. So actually, the National Post op-ed took the minister to task for this statement here, where she said that experts continue to be divided, and challenged her to say which experts were actually divided, because in the academic literature, at least, there hasn't been a strong counter-argument to this. The police are opposed. So I didn't present it to a lot of the background, but as most of you will know, the Vancouver site was approved when there was a federal Liberal government in place. The Vancouver site only exists because it has received an exemption from the Controlled Drug and Substances Act, which is the act which makes some drugs illegal and other drugs legal in Canada. The Conservative government, when it was elected, initially gave the site one extension, and then announced that they were not going to give any further extensions to the site. The Portland Hotel Society, which is the nonprofit organization that runs the Vancouver site, challenged that in court. It went to the BC Supreme Court, which ruled in, it first went to the BC, whatever the regular courts are, which ruled in favor of keeping the site open. It went to the BC Court of Appeal, which ruled that the site should stay open based on a right to health. And then it went to the Supreme Court of Canada, which also ruled that there was that the right to health, that there was it's actually, it's an interesting decision to read. I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but they actually cite evidence as a reason for their decision. And so that because there was evidence that there was improved health from the facility, that right to health superseded the minister's interest in making drugs illegal. They also ruled, people tend to forget it, there was also a question about whether drugs should be legal at all, whether the minister should have that capacity to make drugs legal. And of course, said yes, quite strongly, that the minister did have that, so that the Controlled Drug and Substances Act is constitutional, but arbitrary applications of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act without considering the health of people who use drugs was not allowed by law. And the Supreme Court in this ruling also discussed in relatively broad terms what would be needed for future such facilities to be established in Canada. And they talked about the need for broad community consultation and the need for evidence showing that there was a need for such facilities. And it wasn't really much clearer beyond that. In June 2013, the government, the federal Conservative government, introduced what they called the Respect for Communities Act. So, and this was a response, they said, to the Supreme Court ruling. What it really did was, though, establish a very high bar for future facilities, including demonstrating need in very particular terms and requiring broad support, including from the police. It's actually setting the act that the police have to be supportive of the establishment of such facilities. As far as I know, the only police force in Canada that has been supportive is the police force in Vancouver, where the chief of police has publicly declared his support. The police in Edmonton have actually been somewhat equivocal that they may be supportive, but the police in Toronto have been consistently on record as saying they're not. That happened in June. In July, the Toronto Medical Officer of Health endorsed that Toronto should have supervised injection services. They want to call them services rather than facilities, because they want to stress that these should not be independent facilities. They should be integrated within existing healthcare services. The Toronto Medical Officer also asked the Board of Health to indicate that they opposed the federal legislation. The Toronto Board of Health voted on that and voted, I can't remember how many people were there, but there were 2 votes against, and everybody else, which was about a dozen people, voted in favor. Parliament prorogued before the Respect for Communities Act was passed. It was reintroduced in October of 2013. It has not yet passed, but it is going through the process. I don't know which reading it's at, but it's going through Parliament right now. No new services or facilities have been established. 2 groups have announced that they are planning to establish, so have publicly announced this. One community health center in Ottawa has announced that they're preparing an application. And the Montreal Department of Public Health itself, not a community health center, but actually the Department of Public Health, has announced that they are preparing an application. And there's a lot of interest in the community, but I can't tell you anything more than that right now. But there's many groups that are interested in other cities as well. And so I'm going to end actually with a few sort of observations. First, our report was about 320 pages long. It had oodles of numbers in it, and really the only number that anybody remembers is 3, right? 3 facilities for Toronto. Sometimes we remember 2 for Ottawa. But it also had a lot of qualifications and limitations. One of the challenges actually is for me was, when I went to listen to the deputations to the Toronto Board of Health when they were talking about implementing supervised injection services in Toronto, and people said things that, quite frankly, are not evidence-based. They said things like, these sites are proven to prevent HIV and hepatitis C. Well, Vancouver hasn't published anything yet about HIV and hepatitis C rates. They've only published on needle sharing. We did some modeling suggesting that it was likely to increase HIV and hepatitis C, but proven to prevent is much too strong a statement. These sites will prevent overdoses in Toronto and Ottawa. Again, nobody has actually, that I've seen, tried to estimate this. Vancouver now has some data about overdoses, suggesting that there is a decrease in overdoses in the proximity of the facility. These sites will save money. This was said over and over and over, which, cost saving versus cost effective, again, is something, and not to tell this audience, that's often confused. We did actually, in our economic analysis, suggest that the Vancouver site would be cost saving. But remember, I said the HIV prevalence rate in Toronto is about 3 to 4%. In Vancouver, HIV prevalence rates are about 17%, which is very high by any international study. Our hepatitis C rates amongst people who inject drugs are about 50%. In Vancouver, they're about 85, 90%. So decreased needle sharing will prevent more infections in Vancouver than in Toronto or in Ottawa. So I don't think they will be cost savings for Toronto. people only ever mention our first recommendation. Our recommendation about evaluation is actually quite nuanced. And it says, you know, if because there are a lot of assumptions on this, if these services don't do what they're supposed to do, there should be the political will to actually follow through on that and either restructure or close down the service. But yeah, people don't want to hear that, so they actually don't. And so there really needs to be consistent attention to messaging. So we work with a lot of stakeholders in this, including people who use drugs. We had advisory committees that were composed of people who use drugs. At the same time, we worked very hard to get the police to participate in our study, as well as business owners and residents. We wanted the broad range of views of everybody. But that can be challenging, and particularly when we want to critically appraise the police's views. So we told the police that, you know, we were going to, we actually have published a paper looking at what the police regard as evidence. What they often cite anecdote or experience. They often don't value scientific evidence, and they give rationales for why they don't value that evidence, why they don't believe some epidemiological data. So we want to be able to do this while at the same time getting the police to participate. So it actually took a long time, and we actually we did a pre-interview with Chief Blair before he did the official interview. The pre-interview was not recorded, and it was entirely just to get him to be convinced that we were legitimate people whom he could trust to represent his views in the real world. But there's similar concerns working with decision makers and with community members. Again, some of the community members, I think, were actually quite concerned that we were going to recommend against the establishment of the facilities, because we said going in that we would run the numbers, and whatever numbers we got out would be the result. The decision makers, you know, particularly the provincial decision makers, it's been challenging to work with them, because although they are on record as being supportive of the principle, you saw that the minister gave very equivocal responses. They've continued to be actually very equivocal in terms of their attitude towards supervised injections. So this is a quote from Evan Wood, who's a very prominent researcher in Vancouver. He says, forces that seek to maintain the harmful status quo in the drug policy arena would be overwhelmed if the medical, public health, and scientific communities stood together and called for evidence-based approaches to tackle drug-related harms. So this is the idea that if we just bomb people with enough evidence, they will change their minds because the evidence is so consistently supportive of harm reduction intervention. I would argue, I actually disagree with that. I think evidence is, we need the evidence, but sometimes a lot of evidence doesn't change practice. And we actually need to think about both the epidemiological and the economic evidence, but also the social values, and what social values are inform this decision, and also how those social values actually inform our research. And here's actually somebody from the Ottawa Police Department, what they said about values in research. Those that are involved in the research are already prejudiced. I don't know of anybody that doesn't research on this whole issue of harm reduction that wasn't already involved with a network or coalition of some sort before getting the funding to do the research. So this is actually problematic because you know, most funding agencies encourage us to be in contact with our communities, to be accountable to our communities, to do community partnered, community-based research. But at the same time, so that's one aspect of this. The other aspect of this is this whole issue of harm reduction. And what I would say is we took an unapologetic harm reduction perspective in doing this research. And that implies that we adopted a certain value structure. And I think that's just fine. But it does actually put us in a certain framework that some people will disagree with, who disagree with harm reduction. And so this, I think, is actually in some ways, it's quite a valid criticism. So values, we often don't like to talk about values in scientific research, right? We often consider rigid values as being ideologically driven, and I think we're generally not trained to think about values. The terms of discourse, when people start talking about values, are often unfamiliar to many people. And then there's a lot of concern about losing control of the message. We want the message to be the number, and then when people start talking about values, then we can no longer control how people talk about the message because they're talking about the values. But I would say that, in fact, there already are some values that we all buy into as scientists, which include rigor in research, advancement of scientific knowledge, collegiality and respect for each other as researchers, freedom of inquiry, freedom of expression. These are all values of one sort. But then harm reduction also brings with it a whole other set of values. Harm reduction is really the idea of reducing the consequences associated with drug use. It's more important than reducing the drug use itself. Needle and syringe exchange programs, methadone are examples of harm reduction interventions that have been widely adopted in Canada. Some of the early writings about harm reduction have been very value neutral and very pragmatic. Some of the more recent frame harm reduction in human rights terms or in social justice terms. Just because of time, I'm going to so one of the things that we did at sort of the end of this was say, well, if it's not really possible to do value-free research in a controversial topic, what are the values that sort of were behind this research? So I call this a retrospective value statement because we didn't actually go in with the research saying these are our values, but I think there's something like this. So it's still those same scientific values of rigor, self-criticism, reflexivity, right? We adopted a harm reduction framework, avoiding rigid judgments. We avoided victim blaming, a social justice perspective. So we really focused on marginalized groups, which is in the health of the marginalized groups and improving their health, which is in distributive issues in health and health determinants and outcomes. We see health as socially constructed. So it's important to analyze systems as well as to look at individuals and how those systems actually contribute to health or wellness or ill health. Value community opinions and expertise as sources of knowledge and experience. So bring in the whole community-based aspect here, and a commitment to free inquiry and willingness to challenge authority. So I've presented a whole lot. Just to say, I think we've been successful in catalyzing a lot of the policy discussion. There was some policy discussion before this. I think after the report it ratcheted up a bit. It has decreased a little bit since, but it is still ongoing. Or it's also been used by as many different community organizations. They've been used by public health organizations. The outcome of policy, in fact, is still unclear because these are really political decisions, they're not purely scientific decisions. There is actually a lot of work going on behind the scenes. One of the issues in doing this kind of research is that I can't actually tell you some of that work because a lot of it is very sensitive. But conducting controversial research requires a fairly thick skin, some perseverance, and a lot of reflection when people start to be critical, not based on the evidence alone, but based on the actual motives of the research. So I'll stop there. I'm sorry, there's not a lot of time for questions, but I'm happy to take a few and stay afterwards.
Fun ride. And this assumes that there's only one intervention for people. So, and this intervention, from what you say, hasn't been proven to the same level that you might hold a legal drug to. So, are there any other interventions that you can put into a cost effectiveness? Like even just like putting them in jail would be one intervention, which would cost society money, which could be a relative option. So why is it only focused on one option, which seems to have very weak evidence?
So we assumed that the status quo included existing harm reduction interventions. So methadone prescribing and dispensing has already existed. We assume that the status quo included enforcement by the police at the same level as it already existed. That all of those things were at their status quo levels. But you're right, maybe expansion of methadone, or maybe increased enforcement, or maybe housing intervention, for people who use drugs would have effects. Unfortunately, there's even less evidence for most of those things than there is supervised prevention. And our mandate really was, I didn't really talk about how this came to be, but our mandate really was to look at supervised injection facilities as an intervention contract. So, our sixth recommendation, remember, was that this should be part of a comprehensive drug strategy. And ideally, we would look at this as a portfolio of interventions. But until we have the evidence to actually to do that, I'm not sure how we would go about it. Well, my one. Right.
That's just like amazing, both from a policy point of view and I guess I just have a question about when to engage with values if we do not share this harm reduction stuff. I mean, you've been very reflective of our own personal perspective, values employed. And I suspect most people in this room totally are like on board with you, like we're rational and blah blah. But there are a lot of people who do not think that. And conservatives, uninformed, they don't know about evidence. And yet, the Minister of Health, who is elected to the Canadian values, that is the most direct instantiation of values. That's as high as you can go when you're operational. He's kind of like not so sure that this is so. I guess, how seriously did you look into other paradigms, other ways of thinking about the values of
So I'll talk about what we did and then what's been done afterwards. We actually, I didn't talk a lot about the qualitative stuff here, but we actually said we wanted to get a very broad range of perspectives in the qualitative focus groups. And so we organized groups with, as I said, the police, not just the chiefs, but also frontline police officers, with fire, because the fire department often, when we call 911, the fire department is often the first, they have the fastest response, so they're the people who often deal with overdoses and with ambulance. We also reached out to business groups, so the business improvement associations, and particularly in Parkdale, in South Riverdale, in Kensington. We reached.
Are you just talk about like kind of like a lot of uninformed ignorance out there, or did you find something constructive?
No, we tried to be very constructive. I mean, I think if you read our report, we tried very hard to reflect the broad range of diversity of opinions and the reasons for those opinions. Not just saying, I think we actually did a fairly good job of not saying, here are these people are just wackos. I mean, we certainly did not want that, and I do not think that at all. Right? I think that there are people who have very legitimate objections, from their own values perspectives to these, and that. So in fact, our report calls very much for deliberative dialogue going forward. And in fact, I wrote a healthy debate, a piece on healthydebate.ca about the federal legislation, and in there I actually tried to be very careful to say that the problem with the legislation, me speaking as an individual now, not from my co-investigators, I have to say that, but the problem with the legislation is not that it calls for a broad dialogue, it's that it constrains that dialogue in such a way that it privileges some groups above others. Right? But that the idea of a broad dialogue is certainly necessary. And that's the theme that runs throughout our report. And so since our report came out, the Toronto Central Lynn, just about 2 months ago, actually commissioned a community group, Bruce and Christopher's House, to do a consultation for Toronto on supervised industrial facilities for Toronto. And so we were invited, we came, we just presented for an hour and then we left. They actually meet for over three full weekends. And their report hasn't been released yet. But there were clearly people at that meeting who represented a broad range. And you know, I was, you look skeptical.
Well, I mean, there's a difference between letting people talk and like seriously engaging with people. And anyway, I mean, it's like, so I guess I'm still not clear as to whether it's actually or whether it's gradually moving people. Let people talk until everyone gets to the point where we know they should be.
I would never put it in those words, but we can probably talk. I mean, I think there's a whole, it's another conversation. I'll just say there's a book called Why We Hate Politics. That's about how decisions are politicized or depoliticized, and they move in and out of that sort of public sphere that I think is very informative. It has informed me a lot in terms of the way I think of this, and maybe that's interested in those. It wasn't like some political science award about 3 years ago, but it's actually a very accessible book, very good book.
Last question. I think looking at even the name of the bill, the Act, and which sounds much better than the Act, reflects that whole "be not in my backyard" attitude is perhaps a stronger value. And I'm wondering if your report went as far as to suggest locations for these sites and what impact that had on community acceptance.
No. In fact, we purposely said that we weren't going to recommend. So if you were paying attention, you see, of course, we actually identified locations when we did the modeling.
Right.
We didn't do the modeling without, those weren't just hypothetical locations,
Yeah.
those were specific locations. But we actually said, we're not going to say where those locations are, because the decision about where to put a location shouldn't, in my perspective, be a technical decision. Right? It's a political decision. It requires that broad-based community deliberation and input from multiple different perspectives. And you can guess. Right? Anybody who works in harm reduction can guess where the highest rates of revenue are going to be. And if you look closely enough at our maps and pull them up, you could actually get it. We didn't label the streets. Somebody actually asked me, could you label the streets? I said, no, we can't. Because we said we weren't going to. But you know, the purpose of our report was not to say there should be supervised industrial facility. You know, take out the second cup in the basement in the first floor of this building and turn it into supervised industrial facility. We didn't. That's not what we were about.
The mixed nature using
No. First of all, we don't have area-specific data, so we assumed that it was similar across the city, but actually, it wasn't until after Public Health actually has does have area-specific HIV incident rates, but they actually never released those publicly. Yes, we didn't start fighting by no. Again, if the government was a much more sophisticated model, but the uncertainties in the input parameters are actually greater than. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks.